partnership with Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. This is the final Great Falls Forum of the 24th season, and we thank you for your ongoing support. We hope to see you again in September as we open our 25th anniversary series. Recording of today's program will be available starting tomorrow on the library's YouTube channel, so please visit lplonline.org for more information. Today, if you'd like to ask a question, those on Zoom will see a Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. Please use that to enter any questions for our speakers. Do not use the chat function. For those joining us on Facebook Live, go ahead and type your questions in the comment box there and we will see them. Today, we're going to talk about local history through journalism. And if you think about it, every single significant event that has ever happened in the lives of Mainers has been reported by generations of local journalists, including here in Lewiston. Today, we're going to walk through the pages of Lewiston's newspapers and reflect on our history and our shared community. As the editor of the Sun Journal, I'm very pleased to introduce you to our staff writer, Steve Collins. A daily journalist since 1987, Steve has served as the State House reporter for the Sun Journal since 2016. Among his awards are the Society of Professional Journalists 2016 Ethics in Journalism Award and the I.F. Stone Whistleblower Award in 2015. Steve is co-founder and board president of Youth Journalism International, a charity based in Auburn that teaches students around the globe about news writing, media literacy, and issues of the day. He's also a self-professed history buff, as you will see during our conversation today. Joining Steve is Dave Chittim, treasurer of the Androscoggin Historical Society. David is a professional land surveyor and engineer who was beguiled by local history after he began a retirement project researching the 200-year-old home he and Penny bought on a handshake in 1977. He consulted with Doug Hodgkin, who is Lewiston's de facto historian, and he introduced David to the Historical Society, where David was elected treasurer in 2013. He says his local interest, in local history far outweighs his knowledge, or so he claims, but I think you'll learn differently today. An admitted Luddite, he draws more comfort from the 19th century than the 21st, so we are going to begin today in the 19th century. Steve, could you please tell us a little bit about the mystery of the headless skeleton, the story of Maine's most spectacular murder case?
Okay, I'll give it a shot. So I am one of those quirky people who like to set aside all my workaday necessities and leaf through dusty old magazines and books and poke around in places that few people bother with because it beats working. And anyway, a few years ago, I stumbled across an old news story about a woodcutter who noticed the bones of a woman lying under the brush, not too far from what was once called the most romantic road in Lewiston. There was nothing left of her but her skeleton, some buttons, and the faded remnants of her dress. And one more thing, the skeleton lacked a head. That was in 1873. That was long before CSI and the FBI or anybody who could run some tests and come up with any answers. It was just a headless skeleton. So what can I say? The story intrigued me. I wanted to know who she was and what happened to her and what the discovery of that first murder in Lewiston meant. When the Lewiston Evening Journal carried a full report on the find that grim fall, it wrote, let me see here, that a sort of supernatural fear creeps over people. The possibilities are so vague and so endless that the imagination is restless. Shadow is more terrible than substance. The paper said the skeleton created a mystery more heart-sickening than the worst certainty. I mean, wow. I read that and I don't want to give anything away, but I will say that I've learned an awful lot about everything I wondered about. I found the answers I sought in the pages of old newspapers, especially the Lewiston Evening Journal, a paper I've come to love. But I also found a lot of valuable information in that is squirreled away by the library and at the amazing Androscoggin Historical Society and in the archives of the state and plenty of other places. To my surprise, I learned that this skeleton became a national spectacle and that even 60 years later, the Lewiston paper could write about it with the assumption that everyone already knew the story. And as I dug into the tale, I found more and more and more about it. and I wasn't quite sure what to do with it, but I'm a writer, so of course I started writing. When I got around to telling an editor about it, something I'm never quick to do, the unfinished piece had 15,000 words. That's about 15 times as much as a pretty darn long news story. But nobody here at the Journal responded with the obvious, what the heck is wrong with you, Steve? Instead, we figured out how to get it all in print. And I said, wow, cool, and added another 10,000 words. Editors really ought to be more careful around me. Anyway, the story is going to run like an old-fashioned serial on Sundays, starting in a few days, and keep appearing weekly until probably December. I think you'll find it worth your time.
I agree. I've read a number of the first chapters, and we will publish the serial in print, but we'll also have it online. So if you miss any of the chapters, you'll be able to go to sunjournal.com and catch up with those. Thank you very much, Steve. Now, let's jump back to 1854 and focus on the DeWitt Hotel, which was a 5-story building on the corner of Park and Pine Streets, right next to the Sun Journal's building, and was well known at the time as one of New England's finest hotels. David, could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, but first I've got to say that's all the more reason for people to subscribe to the Sun Journal to see this serialized murder story. I'm looking forward to reading it myself in print. Actually, 1854 is questionable. The DeWitt Hotel did exist on the corner of Park and Pine Streets. You can see the picture on your screen in front of you. It was originally built in roughly 1854, but it was built by the Franklin Company as a 4-story building. We have to get back into the Franklin Company a little bit to understand more about the history of the DeWitt, which, as Judy said, was at the time one of Maine's premier hotels. People from all across the country came here. It was initially built by the Franklin Company, which was essentially the landowner for the entire city of Lewiston. The records of the Franklin Company do not indicate when the building was actually dedicated or opened. 1854 seems to be the year, and it appears oftentimes in print, but it's uncertain. Now, during its history, the DeWitt House, as it was called, has had a number of different aspects. You see here in front of you a copy of the register, which is in the possession of the Historical Society. It may not be visible, but 2 of the people listed in the register are Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody. They came to Lewiston perhaps 7 or 8 times during the late 19th century and early 20th century, and they stayed at the DeWitt Hotel, the DeWitt House. Their itinerary was phenomenal. They were in Portland one night, Lewiston the second night, Waterville the third night, and my first question was, wow, that's a lot of traveling. It was all done by train, of course, and the hotel register indicates that they had to be aroused and gotten to the railroad station by 7 o'clock in the morning. The DeWitt Hotel was one of the first that provided a livery service, like today's shuttles from your Holiday Inn to the airport. You could catch a shuttle from the DeWitt to either the the Grand Trunk Railroad on Lincoln Street or the passenger terminal on, forget the name of the street. Anyway, Franklin Company was an interesting, beneficent oligarch. It gave Kennedy Park to the city, although obviously it wasn't known as Kennedy Park at the time, with the condition that the city spend $5,000 within 2 years to grade it and to put up fences and plant trees. This was in 1861. $5,000 in 1861 represented about 7% of the annual tax revenue of the city. So this was not a generous offer from Franklin Company to the inhabitants of Lewiston. It came with many strings, among which are no building shall ever be built on the park. The DeWitt was one of the first hotels in the area to offer, and I was surprised to find this myself, hot and cold bathing rooms. So people who lived in the tenements, people who worked in the mills, and had no running water or water in the bathrooms could rent a bathing room with either hot or cold water. Presumably the hot water cost more at the DeWitt on an hourly basis. The DeWitt had a fireplace in every room. Of course, there was no central heat. So when you registered, you would also buy the fuel, the logs, the wood to put in your fireplace to heat your room. There was a fire at the DeWitt in 1909. It made the newspaper, the Lewiston Journal, I believe. Unfortunately, it indicated that the firemen got into the liquor supply at the DeWitt and had a hard time getting the fire out. Fortunately, our fire department today is far more professional than that. But in 1909, that was apparently an acceptable behavior. One of the final elements of the DeWitt house is that in 1945, Benjamin Mays, who was a mentor for Martin Luther King Jr. and graduated from Bates College in 1920, Benjamin Mays came back to speak in Lewiston in 1945, and unfortunately was denied service at the DeWitt. Earlier, people of color had eaten in the dining room, and several local women got up and marched out, saying they would not patronize an institution that allowed colored people into the dining hall. So, as much as I admire the DeWitt, there are many circumstances in its history that leave much to be desired. The DeWitt, unfortunately, was razed in 1965 and was replaced with a bank, which was then occupied by the Sun Journal for a period, and now I think stands vacant, does it not?
It does. Yep. So
there, in a nutshell, a history of one of Maine's preeminent hotels.
So I am often surprised when I look through our archives and see how often the DeWitt is mentioned or photographed. And there was a series of stories when it met the wrecking ball in 1965, when it came down, about how sorry people were to see it go. But I will just share that one of my coworkers, who will remain unnamed, told me that there was once a tunnel that went from the basement of the DeWitt to the basement of City Hall. It was tunneled right under the street. I don't know why people would want to go from those two buildings unseen in public, but the tunnel was closed off, of course, when the city installed septic system in the street. I was disbelieving, so he took me down to the basement in that old building and showed me where that tunnel was walled up. It's kind of creepy down there, but I just wonder why that tunnel was necessary. So maybe Community Concepts, when they take over ownership or action in that building, they have to demolish that. Maybe they can go in there and take a look, take some pictures before it's all gone for good. Thank you, David. Clearly, the most significant sporting event in Lewiston's history was the heavyweight title fight in May of 1965. Steve, could you tell us a little bit about the night of the Ali Lewiston fight? Well, it wasn't the Colisee. I don't even remember what it was called anymore, but it came to Lewiston.
It's the Central Maine Youth Center. Youth Center. It's not a Madison Square Garden kind of venue that you'd expect for a major heavyweight fight. So what happened? So it's 1965. They were going to have it's a rematch of a fight that Sonny Liston and Muhammad Ali had a bout in Miami in 1964, and Ali had won the heavyweight championship of the world, and this was going to be a rematch. So a big fight. Everyone in the whole world is paying attention. Boxing was a much bigger thing then than it is now, and they were going to have it in Massachusetts, but there were a series of problems that happened in Massachusetts, including a fear that the Nation of Islam might try to kill Muhammad Ali, who was still sort of known as Cassius Clay. He was kind of in the process of changing his name, and for a lot of reasons, they decided it couldn't be in Massachusetts. So they looked around and said, "Where can we do this? Everything's ready. We've got all the sort of the money lined up for showing this fight here and there," and they found what we call the Colisee, and a tiny venue in an out of the way place, but here it is. So that night, a young and energetic Ali comes into into the ring against Sonny Liston. It was kind of a a bigger, stockier fighter, and danced around him as he was prone to do. And as Lewis and Son sports editor Ted Taylor put it, Ali winged Sonny the sneak shot that laid him low. It was called the Phantom Punch because so few people actually saw it. And Sonny Liston went down just like in that picture. And Ali's up there ahead of him. It was 1 minute into the fight and it was over. I mean, the shortest heavyweight fight in history. Still the shortest by far. And it was, it immediately set off. And to their credit, so was it Taylor? I think it was Taylor. The Journal sports editor, anyway, wrote that very day that this was going to be something that people were going to argue about for years to come. And he's right, because people still argue about it, of whether that fight had been fixed. Was there a mafia connection? Was there some kind of gambling issue involved? And people still argue about it. There's some evidence that it was fixed, and there's plenty of people who think it wasn't fixed. So who knows? I'm not sure what else is really worth saying. It was, the governor at the time said this is the greatest thing to ever happen in Maine, which of course isn't true because we invented earmuffs in Maine. But it was a big deal in Lewiston. I mean, you talk to people today. I mean, people still talk about seeing Ali or seeing Liston, and it's just kind of this amazing thing that's something that is world renowned, that people all over the place know about, and it happened right here. And even Time magazine had a thing a few years ago to pick the greatest sports picture of all time. And the picture that they picked was Muhammad Ali standing with his arms up in the air over Sonny Liston prone on the ground. I mean, and that was right here. It's an amazing thing that happened. And of course, the Sun and the Journal covered the heck out of it. They wrote about it for weeks ahead of time and for a long time afterward. And that's it.
Yeah, because Muhammad Ali actually trained at Poland Spring in the weeks leading up to that fight too. So the coverage was not, it was way more than just that evening, that minute of that night. It was weeks ahead of the training camp. And it was amazing how close our journalists, our photographers, our writers were able to get to the athletes who were training. That wouldn't happen today. But we had a lot of coverage from that. We are going to reprint the Journal's coverage of the fight in Saturday's edition, and it's really quite interesting. And what I did not know until I read that story was this was not the only bout that night. There were 6, and all of them went unusually short. It was just a very strange night of fighting, but really quite memorable. And the photos are there's just pure treasures. We still have some original art here that we hold dear to. So
even now, 67 years later, you can see YouTube videos of the fight and analyses and exploration of the Phantom Punch. Rocky Marciano weighs in on how he feels about what went down in under a minute that night at the Colisée.
Well, and plenty of local people were there, and they're always happy to tell you what they saw and what they heard. And I remember when we did a retrospective several years ago, there was one woman we spoke to who took that moment to run into the restroom and missed the whole thing. And it's like she wished she could just like turn back time. Yeah, so she had to read about it, in the paper, because even though she was there, she didn't see it, which is too bad. So there's a lot going on there. And we will look at our sports journalism over the course of the year too, at this fight and some other significant events as we unroll our anniversary celebration. Thanks, Steve. David, let's turn to Alonzo Garcelon, who founded the Lewiston Falls Journal in 1847, and who also served as the 36th governor of the state. Your specific focus on him, though, is on the 12 days that shook Maine in 1879.
I'm thankful to you, Judy, and the library and the paper for putting this together, because I have studied Alonzo Garcelon more in the past few days than ever before. And this 12 days that shook Maine in 1879 seems to be an anomaly in the career of an illustrious native son. He was born in 1813 in Massachusetts. I'm waiting for someone to correct me on that, but in fact, this was Massachusetts. He was born right here in Lewiston, and went to Bowdoin College, served as the Surgeon General during the Civil War, was elected mayor of Lewiston, was a benefactor of Bates College, and generally speaking, was fairly well renowned and highly regarded in the area. Unfortunately, the election of 1878 pointed to a side of Alonzo Garceland that doesn't appear to flourish in any other venue. In 1878, there were three candidates for, 1879, there were three candidates for Maine governor. The Republican was Daniel Davis. The Greenback, and I'll talk about Greenbacks a little bit, was Joseph Smith. And the Democratic incumbent, who had served his one-year term after being mayor of Lewiston, was Alonzo Garceland. He is a Democrat. Although he had been a Republican before, and in fact was named as the delegate to the first National Republican Convention in 1856, I believe. In this 1879 election, Alonzo Garceland, the incumbent governor, came in a distant third out of three. He had 15% of the popular vote. The Greenback candidate, Joseph Smith, had 34%, and the challenger, Republican Daniel Davis, a tantalizing 49.5%. Now, in those days, you had to have a majority of the popular vote in order to become governor. So there was no governor. The protocol at the time was for disputed elections to be thrown into the Maine Senate. The Senate would decide then which candidate would emerge victorious for the governorship for the next one-year term. Long about December of 1879, the candidates for Senate were being seated, and those required the Executive Council to approve their elections. The Executive Council consisted of members of the cabinet and the governor. Recognizing that the Republicans would take control of both houses and the governorship if Davis was elected or was chosen as the candidate, Alonzo Garceland and his cohorts began a systematic purging of Republican votes. Votes that were discounted included votes for Nelson Dingley and Nelson Dingley Jr. on the grounds that this is one person who voted under two names. Well, Alonzo Garceland knew full well Nelson Dingley and Nelson Dingley Jr. because they were compatriots of his. Nelson Dingley Jr. actually was the editor, owner, and publisher of the Lewiston Journal at the time. So he well knew that Nelson Dingley was Nelson Dingley Jr.'s father. There was a candidate from Skowhegan, from Biddeford, I believe, whose middle initial was altered, and his vote was discounted. Republicans, or the entire area of around Skowhegan, was thrown out and discounted because the report of the Skowhegan selectmen was submitted in two columns instead of one. So they were deemed unofficial and were rejected. All of these areas were Republican areas, and the result was that the Senate was heavily stacked with fusionists. Fusionists were a combination of Greenback and Democrats. This essentially guaranteed that the new governor would not be Daniel Davis, the Republican, who had won almost a majority. The public got wind of this in late December of 1779 and into January of 1780, and were understandably outraged. This is sort of a precursor to our January 6th incursions last year. The governor was very concerned about insurrections and uprisings, so he began assembling a paramilitary group of armed men. The police chief in Augusta had supported 200 armed, or provided or promised 200 armed individuals. Armaments from the Bangor Armory were transshipped to Augusta in preparation for a standoff in the State House. Discovered in the State House were armed men, these paramilitary individuals who were ostensibly there to defend liberty. Joshua Chamberlain became involved. He was the president of Bowdoin, but he was also the commander of the state militia at the time, and he was called to Augusta to try and maintain order. One of the famous incidents during this is that there were 25 or 30 armed men outside the State House, and they were threatening to storm the State House. Joshua Chamberlain came out onto the steps overlooking the park, threw open his coat, and said to the assembled armed men, "I understand there are people here who aim to kill me. I've been in that position before, and I don't deserve it any more now than I did then. But I am here to ensure that the processes and protocols of our election are honored. I am not here to choose who the next governor will be, but I am here to make certain that liberty and democracy are maintained. If my death is required for that, then I challenge you to shoot me." Obviously, no one did, because ultimately he went back to Bowdoin to resume his presidency there. Let me see now. Oh, Thomas Reed Brackett was a newly elected representative from Maine in the U.S. House of Representatives. He later became the Speaker of the House, but he was thoroughly embarrassed by this display in Maine of shenanigans in the State House. It's a black stain on Maine history. It was reported nationally at the time. I don't understand how Alonzo Garceland, an otherwise upright and upstanding individual, allowed himself to be embroiled in this controversy. But he was, and it continues to be a stain on democracy and politics in Maine. Alonzo Garceland, born in Massachusetts, died in Massachusetts in 1906 while visiting his daughter, buried now in the Riverside Cemetery here in Lewiston. Garceland Field at Bates College is named in his honor and memory, and he has a solid reputation here in the Lewiston community as, generally speaking, an upright and forthright individual. So an anomaly, and I'm pleased to have learned more about it, but it has piqued my interest, and I would like very much to find out what happened in this fellow's head in 1879.
It is really interesting to read what happened day to day and then look back at it from, all these years gone by as a sort of collapsed, where we can see how all the pieces fit together. But as it was unfolding, it wasn't all that clear, but it is fascinating nonetheless. The Sun Journal has just recently digitized every edition of its newspapers over time, and they are available on newspapers.com for anybody who wants to read those specific day-by-day accounts. It is just really interesting to take that step back in time. And with the backdrop, as David mentioned, of today's political climate, there's some ironies there.
This was front page news in the Lewiston Journal for up to 3 weeks, 20 days at a minimum, constant. Now, the Journal at the time had, unknown to me, it had several editions. It had a 5 o'clock edition, it had an afternoon edition, and this was constant front page news.
So, David, we have a question from the audience. Who actually won the governor's seat in 1879?
Ultimately, that was given to Daniel Davis, who, as I said, had just shy of the popular vote majority. This did go to the Supreme Court, and in fact, Alonzo Garceland ignored the first opinion of the Supreme Court. It went back again, and it was the Supreme Court that said this is the process and this is the procedure, and these votes are going to be validated, and we'll not have any more of these shenanigans.
Wow. Well, thank you. As many people in our audience will recall, in 2002, then Mayor Larry Raymond wrote an open letter to the Somali community asking them to pass the word that the city of Lewiston had been overwhelmed by the number of families migrating here. And in his letter, he wrote, "Now we need breathing room. Our city is maxed out financially, physically, and emotionally. The Somali community must exercise some discipline and reduce the stress on our limited finances and our generosity." That letter, which was really, was a one-pager and not sent to a particular person, but to the community at large, really caused a firestorm here. And there's still some reverberations from that time. So Steve and David, if you could talk about the letter and its repercussions, please.
Well, I think that the reason we wanted to talk about this is because it's important for people to recognize that history isn't something that happened a long time ago. It's still happening. And you know, when you look at Lewiston for the, you know, in recent decades, the big story here clearly is that we have had an influx of immigrants, first from Somalia, and then we've had a lot from other African nations, the people who fled, you know, nightmare situations back home. They come here in search of peace and the prosperity that America has provided to all of us. And so that the repercussions of that change have just affected the community in so many different ways. And that the letter that Mayor Raymond wrote is kind of the one seminal moment in all of that, because it sort of crystallized a fear, and a sort of an understandable fear of people who had been here about this big change that was happening. And it also, and I guess it's also important to point out that the letter itself, even though it became really famous and covered in lots and lots of stories, it didn't have any legal meaning at all. I mean, a mayor can write a letter about anything he wants to, or she wants to, but it had no legal impact. It doesn't mean anything at all, except as a kind of symbol. And in a way, you know, it's worth noting that the letter itself was on every possible level, it was a flop. I mean, he wrote the letter asking Somalis to stop coming. They didn't stop coming. The community has continued to grow and grow and grow. But it did have the effect of sort of energizing these newcomers into realizing that they weren't necessarily, it gave them suspicion of government that they still hold today. And it helped to make it so they organized, they created new institutions. And all of this stuff has been sort of the bread and butter for the newspaper all along. I mean, you go through this page after page after page in recent decades, there's always stories about issues that are related to all of this. There were, and it also made Lewiston become sort of this I don't know, sort of a target almost for white supremacists and people who are scared of this. You know, we still hear it from, you know, well, today. I mean, you hear it all the time, really, and they've created this sort of fear in the community that somehow this place isn't safe because Somalis are here, which is just it's ridiculous to anyone who's been anywhere else, because Lewiston is, by any statistical measure, one of the safest cities in America. But a lot of people don't think so. And it's sort of this sort of weird fear that is, you know, there's a little racism, but it's also a little just unsettling to people who've been here. Sure, go ahead, David.
Well, I was going to say, Steve, that this contretemps isn't new, and we seem not to be able to learn from it. We had the influx of the French Canadians coming down, and they were met with scorn and disdain and fear and trepidation. Yep. We had the Irish immigration during the 1850s, and the same situation happened with them. Yep. In a bit of a tie back to our earlier discussion that we had, As a result of Mayor Raymond's letter, Muhammad Ali, as he is now known, in 2003, wrote a letter to the Many in One Coalition of Lewiston Auburn, which you see on your screen here. This is as a result of, or in concert with, the conflicting demonstrations that we had here in Lewiston. David Stearns stood in at the World Church of the Creator for its founder, Matt Hale. This was a white supremacist group that had reflected or had been attracted by Mayor Raymond's letter and threatened to come to Lewiston. It did come to Lewiston in a demonstration of, quote, white solidarity. Unfortunately, Matt Hale wasn't able to attend because he had been arrested the day before in Chicago for threatening or arranging for the murder of a federal judge. David Stearns was here, and Jim Bennett, who was city manager at the time, very reluctantly gave them the Armory as a focus, as a place to assemble. Jim was very unhappy about this. I've spoken with him directly, and he said, this is a First Amendment or a freedom of speech issue, and we cannot deny them the right to assemble here. However, that assembly attracted 36 people. 36 people. On the Bates campus, about 2 miles, or less than a mile away, actually, were 4,200 people rallying in support of the Somali immigrants who had attracted Larry Raymond's letter to begin with. So that's one of the many aspects of Lewiston that makes me just proud to be a resident as a citizen here, because this 4,200 versus 36 makes a very strong statement about the way we feel in Lewiston about embracing anybody who wants to come here. So,
well, and if I remember, the day of the Many in One rally was really, really cold. It was dead January. And I remember walking across the Bates campus and never being prouder of the city, because so many people were walking so far to get there and be there and be part of the voice. It was really something.
Well, it's interesting that Susan Collins, Olympia Snow, Mike Michaud, and Tom Allen, our entire congressional delegation, was there at this rally. None of them spoke. They were merely there because they personally felt connected and they felt that it was important. Governor Baldacci, who had been in office for 5 days as governor, spoke at the rally, as did Attorney General Steve Rowe. But our congressional delegation was there in person, not trying to draw attention to themselves, but simply supporting the cause. Yeah. Very important day in Lewiston history.
And one that I think set the stage going forward, that it was clear that Lewiston was going to stand together. And that, I mean, there's certainly been glitches and bumps along the way. And I know, we've had a lot of hard conversations here at the paper about, do we run this letter to the editor from somebody who wants to say something about this, or do we not, out of kindness to the community? So it just goes on and on and on. So yeah, we do have a question. Somebody wants to see the letter from Ali once again, quickly before we move on. But it is worth taking a look back for those of you who either don't remember or weren't living in Lewiston at the time. It was we marked a real point in time there, for sure.
That letter actually is in the possession of the Androscoggin Historical Society. So anyone who wants to see it for real is welcome to come and take a look at it.
Oh, thank you. That's great to know.
Mm-hmm. All
right, David, let's get you back to your comfort zone and move back to 1890. And let's revisit the fire that consumed Lewiston City Hall, which once stood at the corner of Lisbon and Main Streets, which I did not know until I was doing some research for this.
Yes, let me find my notes here. Lewiston City Hall was initially, it was a town hall in the central block, which is the building that now houses Dostie Jewelers at the corner of Lisbon and Main Street. That was Lewiston's first government office. It was a town at the time, so the town offices were in the central block. That central block burned in 1870, shortly after Lewiston. Lewiston was incorporated as a town in 1795 and chartered as a city in 1861. So I misspoke. It was actually a city when the city hall burned. Obviously, there was a need for a government building. So the city fathers got together and decided that they were going to build a new city hall at the corner of Park and Pine Streets, the location of the present city hall. This was built over the course of 20 months. It was dedicated in 1872. It cost $201,076.62 to build. This was at a time when bricks were selling for 1 cent a piece. In today's dollars, that's really not quite a bad deal. It's about $5 million today. And we think relatively little of spending $5 million on a building these days. I mean, look at what's happening with the schools and some of our other structures that are up in the tens of millions of dollars. So $201,000 plus change was a lot for the day, but comparatively speaking, not that great. The building was dedicated in 1872 and became the functioning center of city life. Not only was the city government there, but the police department occupied the basement. The jail was in the basement. The jail was a vast improvement over prior detention areas, which were fetid and just disgusting places to be. This was described in the Lewiston paper as being palatial in terms of its hospitality for vagrants and guests, as they were referred to. The post office was in the city building. The post office rented space, although there was some dispute about that because apparently the lease was never properly signed. And there were a few years where the post office apparently lived in the city building for free. City fathers were not overly happy about that, given that the post office is a federal institution, and they figured that they were providing space for it. They ought to be paid for it. Those finally were smoothed out, but let's see what else was in there. We had a showroom. There was the cause of the fire of this 1872 structure, which occurred in 1890, was believed to be straw and refuse that accumulated in an elevator shaft from a poultry show that was occurring at the time. Not only was there a poultry show, but in the small hall, which housed 600 people, in the small hall, there was a dog show. So City Hall served as a number of different functions. All of the dogs, you'll be pleased to know, were rescued from the building, although the fowl were not. There's a story going around that shortly after the fire, a boy from Lincoln Street showed up with a rooster with singed feathers and tails and was soliciting money for the health of the rooster. There was some thought that this was perhaps a fraudulent endeavor on the part of an industrious or entrepreneurial young individual. So dogs were saved. Unfortunately, books were not. One of the other functions of this second city hall was its service as the city library. Most of the books, I think 300 volumes, were saved. Those were the Merchants and Mechanical Library. That was the group, the beneficial group that spent the money to buy the books in the first place. Some of those books are still in the Lewiston Public Library, and they have that Merchants and Mechanics seal inside them. Only 300 books were saved out of a vast library. So there was a huge loss to the city in that regard. Many of the city records were saved because they were put into the previously untested vaults in the basement of the building. The city clerk and other individuals were frantically removing items from the building as it burned. The fire lasted over 12 hours, and the remains of the building were vertical walls, hulks, that stood at the corner of Pine and Park Streets for several weeks before the ultimate decision was made to tear them down. There was some thought at the time that perhaps the building could be salvaged, but it was not. And the decision was made to raise the building and construct a new city hall on the same site. That new city hall is the structure that we now call City Hall. Diagonally across from the DeWitt House, and perhaps connected because of some scurrilous activity between the Franklin Company and the city government. One never knows.
Oh, maybe it was a perfectly legitimate reason.
Well, prohibition occurred sometime in the early 20th century, so that might have had something to do with it.
And didn't the DeWitt have a speakeasy, allegedly, at some point in it?
There is a story, and I think it was published in the Lewiston paper, that there was a small room discovered in the basement of the DeWitt house when it was raised. The adjective small to me doesn't suggest a speakeasy, but if one wants to imagine that folks gathered there during Prohibition after knocking on the door and uttering the password, then so be it.
Thanks, David. On a more somber note, in 1965, a Lewiston police officer, Paul Simard, was shot and killed when he responded to the report of a domestic disturbance. And 30 years later, almost to the day, Officer David Payne was shot and killed when he responded to the report of a car that had gone off the road. Steve, could you talk a little bit about these officers and the park that has been named in their memory?
Sure. So let's start with Paul Simard. So he was a young father. This was actually in 1958, and and there was just a call that a 14-year-old girl had run away from her home, and she was like out in the woods, just out just beyond the town line, I believe. And the police went out and they're searching for her, as they would do. And Paul Simard was out there in the woods, and they realized that she had a gun, and he called to her. The exact words here that he called to her to put the gun down, and instead of putting the gun down, she pulled the trigger and put a bullet right through his forehead out in the woods, and he fell down to the ground. The other officers didn't even know that he'd been hit. It was all just quick. They caught her, and she put the gun. I think she took a shot at another officer and missed, and then they took her into custody. And one of the interesting things when you read the stories back then is they were full of pictures of this young girl, all kinds of stories about her mental issues, her details of her problems at home and stuff. It's just a very different kind of coverage than I think we'd see today, because it was like, no, she was treated like anybody else when she was clearly a very mixed up young teenage girl. And ultimately she went to trial and ended up getting into state custody for, I think it was 8 years, and got help and got out. And I think she's still alive today, but never got into trouble again. But Paul Simard's family never had this officer. He was the first Lewiston officer to be killed in the line of duty, and he'd just been out doing his job like officers do. And so then we flip forward to 1988, I think it was, and another young father, David Payne, was out. There was a call that on River Road there'd been a traffic accident, and police responded to it, not thinking there's any kind of a problem. But it turned out that one of the men who was there, was a wanted fugitive, a kind of dangerous, particularly dangerous man. He ran into the woods. The officer, there was a shootout, and Officer Payne wound up with a gunshot to the chest that killed him. So those two officers, the only two Lewiston officers who have been killed, and hopefully there'll never be another. But they, so we've honored them as a city, like by naming a park for them. And I think that's one of the things we were talking about with David is that, you know, naming things after people is a way of helping to remember them. Because, you know, we run news stories, people forget, and we don't remember things. And putting a name on it and a plaque down at the park means that at least occasionally someone's going to stop and look at that and remember these two men who gave their lives for our community and just doing their jobs. And there's lots of places where you know, if you go around town that you can sort of, the past is right there because the names are there. You know, Mayor Raymond has a little park named after him down on Main Street. And David and I were talking the other day, across the street here from the Sun Journal, there's a little bronze star on a pole that says Henry Roberson, 1868 Square. And it's been one of the great, it was put up after World War I. And after we talked, I was trying to find out, like, who was this guy? So I'm searching through newspapers.com and all our records and everything. I couldn't find anything. Nobody knows who he was, why that sign is even there. It's kind of weird. But it's just it's striking. Go ahead, David.
Well, I was going to say, Steve, this is one of those things where crowdsourcing might help us out.
Yeah.
Who was this Roberson? And I know that there's been a topic of discussion in City Hall. We know about Hewlett Square, for example, or Haymarket Square. We have much more information about that than we do this Roberson, whom we think might have been a Civil War hero, but on the other hand, you say it was erected after World War I, which is more information than I knew. Yeah.
I know a car hit it and chipped the star in 1928. But
and yet it's still there.
It's still there.
Yeah. Well, I will share with our audience that when we write about, you know, when these two officers were killed, these are some of the hardest stories to write about because they're about people and victims and people who are charged, and everybody who is involved in stories like this, they're hurting. And as journalists, we approach those stories knowing that, but also knowing our obligation is to report that information to our community. And it can be very emotionally charged for the reporters who are at the scene, but we are aware every single day that what we are recording is for history, and we take that very seriously. We have fun along the way, but we understand every minute of every day how critical our job is to informing the community. So we're gonna keep right at it.
Yeah.
And we I am happy to field some questions for our panelists, but while people are typing in their questions, David, do you want to talk a little bit about the Historical Society's pending move?
No, I don't want to talk about that at all. Yes, as many of our viewers may know, the Androscoggin Historical Society has been toiling away in relative obscurity on the third floor of the county building across the river in Auburn. We've been essentially a guest of the county, but access to us has been limited for a number of reasons. The parking isn't great. It's up on the third floor. With new security measures at the court, it becomes a little more daunting to get into our area. And our board has been, for the past 5 years, focused on an effort to get involved much more in the community. We are trying to transition from a social club of gray hairs who sit around and drink tea and talk about the good old days to an organization that is far more involved in today. As Judy just said, today's news is tomorrow's history, and the work that the journalists of today are doing are actually recording history. It's impossible to do in an unbiased way, but it certainly is the foundation for it. In fact, the Historical Society has recently donated its entire collection of Lewiston newspapers, stretching from 1860 to 1920, to the Maine State Library. We are moving from the third floor of the county building to 93 Lisbon Street. We've purchased a building, and we're in the process of moving literally tens of thousands of artifacts and archives across the river with a dedicated team of volunteers. So we're looking forward this year, we hope, to having a grand opening at 93 Lisbon Street between the district courthouse and Rainbow Bikes. Little plug there for John Grenier and his folks, but that's where we are, and we are hoping that we'll be open at least 40 hours a week, and we're hoping that passersby will look in the window and say, wow, that's a really fascinating place. I think I'll go in. With that, we hope to get our community involvement much more active than we have been in our prior 99 years. We'll be 100 years old next year, so look for that too. Thank you for the opportunity to plug AHS.
Sure. So like the Ali letter that, you know, could we just, once you're moved and you're all organized, can the public just come in and ask to see items in the collection? What are the rules?
Well, we had up on the third floor, everything in the collection was essentially on display. Everything we knew about. We're finding things that we didn't know we had. I mentioned earlier that we've just discovered that we have the first 14 weeks of the Lewiston Falls Journal in paper copy. We didn't know we had that. Our cataloging has only been active for the past decade or so. So for 90 years, people would give us things and we'd say, oh, thanks, and we'd put them in a corner. The new rules are going to be that if you want to look at a specific item, give us a day or two to find it in our collection and make it available. And we're happy to share that with anybody who wants to take a look at it. The Muhammad Ali letter is currently on display on the third floor. It may go into storage or it may be on display. We're hoping to convert from the grandma's attic type of here's everything we have to a more thematic rotating exhibits built around a particular geography or chronology or topic. Some things will be on permanent display, but our collections committee is in the process of deciding which of those will be. Everything will be accessible to the public, provided we have enough time to get it out and get it ready for viewing. So give us a call, look us up on our website. And if you're interested in seeing the third edition of the Lewiston Falls Journal, we can make that happen.
Which for anybody who's seen some of those early papers, they crammed a lot of stuff on the front page. There was no room for sketches. Of course, it was before newspaper photography, but it was, it didn't seem to be any kind of
there you go.
design we recognize today. We do have some in the audience reminding us that there was another Lewiston officer who was killed. Rancourt, the Rancourt Preserve is named for him. I think that was well before the Samard shooting. So
I think he was a sheriff. I think he was a sheriff's deputy.
Sheriff's deputy. Oh,
David
Rancourt. Yes, it was a
Rancourt.
drowning. Yes,
Right.
Yeah.
he was
David
doing a
Rancourt,
dive testing. Yes, thank you. Yep.
yes, he
Yep.
was not killed. He died in the line of duty.
He died
but
in the line of
he was
duty.
not
Yep.
killed.
Yep.
Anyone who wants, take the Riverside Trail up, and there is a beautiful overlook on the Androscoggin River that is David Rancourt Park. There's a bench out there, and it's a very tranquil place to be. You'd hardly realize that you're in the second largest city in the state of Maine when you take that trail and go out. It's a wonderfully sited and very underused park.
It is lovely. I agree with you there. Well, thank you very much to our audience. Thank you to David and to Steve, the Historical Society. If you want to check out their collection or donate to their capital campaign, go to androhistory.org. And again, we are celebrating our 175th at the Sun Journal this year with lots of special reports and special editions. So please go to sunjournal.com/175, 175th. And look for newspapers.com, and you can read everything our journalists have ever written over the years. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Judy and Steve, and thank you, Lewiston Public Library and Bates College for sponsoring these forums.
Indeed.
Have a pleasant summer, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.